welcome to this video on materials. This is really basically a theory lecture that will talk you through some of the different materials that are available in the timber industry to use for furniture making projects. By the end of this specific lesson, I'm going to be running you through 5 different species of timber that we use in furniture making. They're not the only types, but 5 that I've picked that are fairly common to be used. I'm going to give you at least 3 key facts about each species that you can use to help decide if you want to use it for your project. And I'm also going to show you where I get this information from and what a reliable source of information might be for further research. You need to actually know these terms and understand how these terms impact a project. And that's the colour profile of the species of timber, the density of the timber, the strength, defects, workability and durability. So there's 6 key terms there that you need to understand the meanings of and how they are actually used to help determine which timber you're going to use for your project. Once you've done this video, you should be able to go off and complete the research section in your folio where you're looking at materials that you might want to use for your project. So I'll start with reliable source of information. I've got the links in my presentation. I'll include them in the description of the video as well. But there are 3 main places that I go to. The first is Wood Solutions. This is a website that's available. You Google Wood Solutions, it's one of the top hits that comes up, and it has a whole range of different hardwood, softwood species available. Gives you information, all of the details that you need for the research parts of your folio. Specifically, it includes all of those different terms, the density, durability, etc. that we spoke about just a minute ago. You've also got your timber textbook that we use in class, that's Woodworking Part 1, has lots of information about the species of timber, and again includes all of that information about durability, colour profile, species, etc. And then there is another website called the Wood Database. It also has some really good information in case Wood Solutions is a little bit too technical for you. So I'm going to get started on our first species of timber, something you should be familiar with. This is Radiata Pine. Now, Radiata Pine, doesn't matter how you pronounce it, same species. And you can see that if we broke timber up into a few different colour profiles, there are 4. There are the light coloured timbers, the dark coloured timbers at the other end, the red coloured timbers, and the pinky brown timbers sort of in the middle. Okay? So we've got 4 different profiles. Radiata Pine sits in the really light coloured ones. We'd probably call this a yellowy straw coloured timber. Okay? So it sits down here in the light coloured timbers. If your client has light coloured furniture at home, you probably want to use some light coloured timber to match in with it. If you are trying to use some contrasting timbers, you would need to pick a timber from outside of the light colour. Maybe you go really dark or even reds to try and get a colour that's going to contrast the lightness from Radiata Pine. Now each different tree has its own qualities and characteristics. Pine is readily available in Australia. We grow it in plantations. It grows usually 25 to 30 years. And because it grows so fast, it has a few defects. Firstly, it can commonly twist because it's dried out so quickly. The grain is quite far apart as well, which increases the chance of the timber moving, so it's not as stable as some of the other harder species. The Radiata Pine quite often has a lot of knots in it, and remember the knots are from the branches. That's just the way the pine tree works. It's a very common feature. Knots can be considered to be a feature within the timber, but they also do weaken it as well. So you've got to acknowledge that while the knots can look nice, they can also be a defect where strength is important. And the other one is they are prone to checking, which is basically when you're working with the timber, putting it through things like thicknesses, it quite often will come up with little marks on it called checking, which is a result of the timber itself and how it grows. Now, density. Density is all about how much weight is in a certain volume of timber. Now, all our timber species are measured in kilograms per metres cubed. That's how we work out our density. And the higher the number, the denser the timber is. And while you look at pine and say 550 kilos, wow, that's a lot, that's half a tonne. That's actually considered to be quite low when you compare it to some of the other species that we'll go through later on. Now remember, if I got a metre wide, a metre deep, and a metre tall, okay, so a big cube of pine, and I put that on scales, it would weigh approximately 550 kilograms. because that's what the density of pine is. So that's what we're working on here. How much really does it weigh for a cubic metre? Now, this is a really good number to look at because it helps us work out how many things are being squashed into that space. So when you've got a low number, there's usually a lot more air in there. When you've got a high number, there's less air and a lot more timber fibres, which usually makes the timber harder to work with. So if we look down at the bottom, we've got workability there. Pine is really easy to work with because it's got a nice low density. The other thing that you'll notice, density and strength are somewhat linked as well. So I've got this sort of strength bar. On the left I've got very high, on the right I've got very low. Pine is pretty low, okay? It's considered to be what's called an S6 on the strength grade. So it's not the lowest is definitely a 7, you can see there. But you can see it's second lowest, so it's quite a low strength timber. You can get stronger versions of pine, but the stuff that we use for furniture making usually are quite low. When we're looking at machine graded pine or MGP10 pine that's used in the construction industry, it's usually creeping close towards the 5s and 4s. Now, because the density is low, the strength is low, therefore our durability is low. Durability is all about how long does the timber last when it's exposed to the elements before it starts to break down and deteriorate. And you can see that pine is expected to last around about 5 years. Sometimes it will last a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit less, but really after that 7-year mark, its strength is really quite weak and it's really dried out and is no longer the same product that you started working with. You compare that to the top of the range here, which is more than 40 years, the high durabilities. That's when we're going to find timbers that will last a lot longer. If you've got a timber that lasts 40 years, you've got to expect that you're going to pay more for it because it's going to last a longer period of time. Pine, because it's so low in its durability, low in its strength, low in its density, quick to grow, plantations in Australia, we're going to find that's quite cheap. Now let's think about working with pine. We call this workability. It's really easy to work with, nice and easy to cut. You've worked with pine in the workshops before, it's really easy to cut by hand, even easier with machine. Usually got lots of knots in it. It can have resin streaks in it as well, but both the knots and the resin streaks can resist glues and finishes. So sometimes if you're putting glue on, it might not stick in spaces. If you're putting a stain on, it might go a little bit blotchy because pine doesn't accept stain very well because of those resins. And also, because of its low density and its low strength, it's actually not very good for steam bending. You can definitely cut thin veneers and do some laminate bending, but steam bending isn't something that's going to work with pine. It's probably just going to snap apart on you. So now that we've got a bit of an overview about all of those different terms, we can now start moving through the other species a little bit faster. So we'll start with spotted gum. Spotted gum, look at that. It's on the dark end of the colour profile. It's a little bit of a chocolatey colour. You can see we've got a sample up there. It's a very high density, 990 kilograms, so almost a whole tonne per metre cubed. And you'll see how that relates then. Strength is right towards the top. Durability, right towards the top. So use spotted gum in your project. That project's going to last you probably 40 years before it weakens and starts to deteriorate. So that's probably, think about how much more expensive spotted gum might cost. If you go back to your costing sheet, you'll see for a piece of pine it might cost $3 a metre. Spotted gum is probably going to cost you about $15 a metre. It's a lot more expensive. Some good things about spotted gum is it's really good to use with machinery. Okay, it's got a nice interlocked grain pattern, usually a little bit wavy, so it actually works in the machines really well. And it's one of those timbers that's really good at accepting glues, paints, stains, and all those other sorts of liquid finishes that you apply. It absorbs them really well. It's also a timber that is really suitable for carving and wood turning, and also for outdoor furniture. Because it's got that high density, that high level of strength, that high level of durability, you can put it outside, it's going to last a long time. Obviously spotted gum inside will last longer, but it can definitely work outside as well. Can be a little bit of an uneven texture, so hard to get smooth at times. Okay, if you run your finger across a centerpiece, you sometimes get some little bumps across it, and that's from the grain. And the grain pattern, you can see it's a little bit wavy. It's not as straight as some species. You can see it going back and forth a little bit like a wave across the image. And each piece is obviously different, but it's known to be quite a wavy species compared to things like pine, which is considered to be quite straight. Moving across to Jarrah. Jarrah sitting in the red category of colour profile, so not the darkest timber available, but quite red, almost towards the chocolate colours. It's a very high strength one as well, not as high in density as spotted gum. You can see 820 kilograms, so sitting in S4s for strength. And you can see the density and the strength went down, and so did the durability. So you can start to see the relationship between these different components. Jarrah is going to last you a long period of time as well. If you built yourself a piece of furniture now, it'll be around for a long period of time. Inside, obviously going to last longer. You put a table outside, it's going to deteriorate faster, but it's still going to last a long period of time. One thing to know with Jarrah, it is really tough to work with. So I've used Jarrah in the workshop a few times to help students with some different projects. It really is unforgiving on the blades. So your blades go dull really quickly, and so it's really important when you're using Jarrah, you've got to keep your blades nice and sharp because they go blunt very quickly. When they go blunt, it's very difficult to cut Jarrah and will start to actually burn, just like any species. So you need to make sure that when you're using Jarrah, you are using really sharp blades. For this same reason, I probably wouldn't be cutting Jarrah with a tenon saw if I could avoid it, because it's obviously going to cut through those teeth real quick and blunt. And it accepts paint, glues, stains and finishes well, just like spotted gum. Okay, so you can see those tight grain patterns, things with wavy grain starting to accept paints, glues and stains really well. This species is really suitable for steam bending, so if you wanted to explore some bending techniques using steam, the Jarrah is one of the species that can work well for you here. But one really important thing for furniture making is it's very difficult to nail and screw because of how dense it is. A bit like spotted gum, but very difficult. We've had plenty of occasions where students have been working with Jarrah and their screws have snapped because of how dense it is. So you really need to make sure that when you're working with Jarrah, that you really consider what metal screws you're using, whether you're using stainless steel, whether you're using steel, or whether you're using some other sort of material, but you need to make sure that you definitely are pilot holding because Jarrah will definitely damage screws there. Oregon, here we go. This one's sometimes called Douglas fir, particularly I think it's called Douglas fir a lot in America. Oregon's pretty common around the place as well. It's sort of in the pink to light colours, probably could fit into the same colour as pine, but probably sits a little bit closer to the pinks. I know the sample picture there that I've got a little bit more like pine, but it sometimes has a bit of a pink colour to it. Low density, just like pine. However, it's got a little bit higher strength than pine, so it's just sitting that little bit higher there. Oregon was very commonly used in housing frames. So my house, when I pulled it apart to do its renovations, all of my framing was made from Oregon, so really nice timber to work with. Durability is quite low, just like pine. Again, low density, lowish strength, durability really pushes down there. It's really good for furniture making, so all sorts of joinery, toning, carving, even really good for plywood because it's quite a stable timber. But it can sort of splinter apart, and for this reason it's really important that your blades are kept sharp so that it doesn't splinter apart. It can be difficult to nail and screw because it's got such defined grain lines. You can see those darks and lights in the grain there, that when you are nailing, quite often the nail, instead of going straight in, will actually bend and twist a little bit to work its way around the grain. And also, just like pine, it's got quite a lot of resin in the timber, which makes it difficult to paint, to apply glues and to finish, etc. Tasmanian oak, here we go. It's one of these special species. It sort of fits anywhere from light to pinky to almost brown colours. It has such a wide range of colour profile, and you can see I've coloured quite a few areas there. It's sitting middle way in the ground for strength, so it's quite a good timber to work with. It's got sort of a moderate density there, and as a result, the durability also increases slightly. Still not a high durability, but better than pine, not as good as spotted gum. Tasmanian oak is, again, grown in plantations around Australia. Similar species to it are things like the Victorian ash, is also an oak type as well. Similar colour profile. Really, really good for staining. This timber really absorbs the stain well, and because it's a light colour typically, you can use it to achieve all sorts of different colours if you're trying to match furniture on a cheap budget. It's quite strong, quite stable, bends really well, both steam and mechanical bending. However, we have to be realistic. Spotted gum is Tasmanian oak is one of those timbers that splinters really easy when it's cutting. Again, if I'm thinking about times when I've used this in projects, when I'm using saws, table saws or drop saws, I very frequently will get splintering at the end of the grain, and so to avoid that I might apply some tape across it to try and stop the grain from splintering, or even using a scribing blade on the table saw. So look, that's a lot of information. I wouldn't expect you to have taken that all in at once, but I do expect you to pause it, go back, write down some notes as you've gone through it, so that you can then apply that to the research in your own project. The next video that I've got coming up is processes. I look forward to seeing you for that. Again, that's going to be a theory-based lecture. We're going to be giving you some information. You can then apply that into your own project. Hope that's been really helpful for you, and again, look forward to seeing you in the next video on processes. If you've got any questions about today's video, just put them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you.